Opening the center immediately claims space and initiates a fight for central control, aiming for rapid development. Embracing asymmetrical pawn structures, this Sicilian gambit immediately sparks a fight for central influence and opens critical diagonal lines. Establishing central presence and preparing for an aggressive pawn push while developing a knight. Solidifying the center while preparing the popular dragon variation, this pawn advance immediately creates counterplay opportunities. Asserting central control and opening lines immediately challenges Black's Sicilian setup, inviting a dynamic battle. Opening the center's fight, this capture immediately challenges White's central pawn structure and defines the ensuing strategic battle. Instantly claiming the center, this knight jump opens aggressive lines while preparing for queenside castling, putting immediate pressure on Black's development. Developing a knight and challenging White's central pawn prepares for an active game. This develops another knight, reinforcing the central pawn and preparing for castling while keeping options open. Preparing to contest the queenside, Black hinders White's potential NB5 ideas. Unpinning the knight and developing a piece, this bishop now eyes the queenside, creating potential pressure and preventing easy development for Black's dark-squared bishop by guarding the E7 square. Finally, Black shores up the D5 square and prepares to develop the bishop, though it slightly weakens the light square complex around the king and blocks the queen's immediate access to the D-file. Boldly seizing central space, White aims to solidify their pawn structure and restrict Black's pieces, particularly the queen's bishop, while creating an aggressive pawn chain that may lead to a kingside attack later. Preparing for castling and reinforcing the kingside are the immediate goals with this developing maneuver, neatly sidestepping the advanced pawn on F4 and maintaining flexibility for the central pawn structure. A decisive thrust, this queen's deployment immediately stakes a claim on the central F-file and puts pressure on Black's kingside, aiming to exploit the eventual open E-file and potentially unravel the enemy monarch's defenses. Preparing to connect the rooks and possibly contest the D-file, this placement of the queen also shields the king from potential early skirmishes along the C-file, a sensible precautionary step given White's pawn storm potential on the kingside. Castling queenside immediately seizes the initiative, anchoring the king and preparing a vigorous pawn storm down the H-file while simultaneously opening the D-file for the rook. Developing the knight to D7 offers crucial support for the E5 pawn, a common target in this Sicilian structure, while also preparing to redeploy the queen's bishop to a more active square, perhaps G4 or F5, to challenge White's aggressive pawn center. Aggressively pushing the kingside pawns here immediately creates a fascinating spatial imbalance and initiates a direct assault on Black's castled position, a risky but ambitious strategy that demands precise calculation. Black boldly challenges White's queenside pawn storm by launching a counteroffensive on the flank, aiming to disrupt White's king's safety and potentially open lines for counterplay. Exchanging the bishop for the knight here is a bold decision, disrupting Black's pawn structure on the kingside and opening up the G-file for a potential assault on the enemy monarch, but it also concedes the bishop pair. The knight's repositioning on F6, while seemingly solidifying the center, begins a delicate dance where Black surrenders the central pawn majority in exchange for potential counterplay on the queen side. This recaptures a piece, yes, but the long-term consequences of accepting a slightly more passive pawn structure compared to White's unleashed kingside attack need careful consideration. Black must now be acutely aware of the open lines that could soon be exploited and focus on developing their remaining pieces efficiently to deter White's encroaching forces. A bold advance, pushing the knight further into enemy territory and potentially opening a vital G-file for future assault, but it also leaves the kingside structure a tad porous. Abandoning the pawn's advance, Black redirects attention to bolstering the center and preparing for counterplay, a sensible reaction to White's aggressive pawn storm, aiming to solidify the king's defense while keeping options open for piece development. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, White aims to shatter Black's defensive structure and open lines towards the castled monarch. This aggressive thrust creates immediate imbalances and forces black to react decisively, lest their king becomes unduly exposed to a dangerous assault. Introducing a dynamic cavalry charge, this knight relocation masterfully injects counterplay into black's position, directly challenging white's central pawn thrust and creating immediate tactical dilemmas. Unleashing a pawn storm, white aggressively pushes the f-pawn, aiming to crack open black's kingside defenses with relentless pawn pressure and a forceful spearhead. The pawn chain has been irrevocably broken, opening a critical diagonal for white's queen and rook, while simultaneously creating lasting weaknesses around black's king. This capture, though seemingly a necessary recapture, forces black into a precarious defensive posture, with the f-file now a highway for white's attacking pieces. Consider the long-term consequences of this structural damage. The weakened kingside will require constant vigilance and precise defensive maneuvers, a heavy burden to bear in a complex middle game. The capture on f6 shatters the protective pawn shield around black's king, opening the g-file and creating long-term weaknesses that white can exploit for an assault. Suddenly, the black queen finds itself exposed to a direct attack from the white bishop, forcing an immediate retreat, while the pawn storm on the kingside continues to advance relentlessly. The bishop's retreat to h3 doesn't just aim to redeploy the piece. It's a subtle repositioning that opens a diagonal for the queen and queen-rook while simultaneously eyeing the weak dark squares around black's king, particularly f7, which is currently unprotected. Consider the potential for future pressure on that kingside. This placement could be a precursor to an attack, or it could be a defensive maneuver to avoid being tangled in the pawn storm developing on the kingside. It also clears the way for the kingside rook to potentially enter the game more actively. Unleashing a pawn storm, black immediately challenges white's kingside setup, seeking to disrupt the castled position and open lines towards the enemy king. This aggressive advance aims to create immediate counterplay by exploiting the slightly exposed nature of the white monarch, forcing white to react and potentially defend. The pawn on b4 now exerts pressure on the c3 knight and indirectly influences the d4 square, potentially disrupting white's central control and defensive structure. It's a bold gambit, sacrificing central pawn structure for dynamic attacking chances. Unleashing a powerful knight on a central outpost, white immediately aims to dismantle black's pawn structure and exploit the newly opened lines for attacking opportunities. Here, black breaks the central tension, accepting a doubled pawn to shatter white's attacking pawn chain and gain a crucial open file. This radical exchange is a calculated risk, aiming to disrupt white's kingside buildup and open lines for counterplay before the threatened f-pawn becomes an unstoppable force. The resulting pawn structure, though imbalanced, offers black dynamic possibilities, especially on the now accessible e-file, potentially allowing for piece activity to compensate for the structural weakness. The king's defense is visibly cracking under this calculated pressure, as white boldly sacrifices material to pry open the dark squares around black's monarch. This pawn thrust is a decisive commitment, aiming to shatter black's pawn shield and create immediate attacking avenues, forcing a difficult decision on how to consolidate or counter in a severely compromised position. Sacrificing the bishop to clear the king's immediate airspace, black aims to disrupt white's attacking pawn structure and open diagonals for counterplay, though it does leave their own king with fewer defenders and a somewhat compromised pawn shield. Unleashing a decisive discovered attack, white exploits the pin on black's king to gain a crucial tempo, forcing a favorable exchange or opening critical lines for further assault. The black king, now exposed on d8, is a glaring weakness that white is expertly exploiting with their aggressive piece play, particularly the bishop on h3 poised to join the assault. Exploiting the loose knight on c5, this aggressive advance immediately targets black's exposed monarch, forcing a crucial decision that will dictate the future king's safety of the black position. Black's monarch, now exposed on the d-file, attempts to find refuge in the shadows of the c-file, a desperate attempt to escape the immediate thunderclap white is preparing. The monarch's exposure, a consequence of the pawn's heroic advance, is now ruthlessly exploited as the queen delivers a decisive blow. The black monarch, exposed and vulnerable, continues its perilous journey to safety, a desperate scramble to escape the encroaching white queen and knight. Opening up the queen's rook pawn to attack the isolated king, this piece sacrifice dramatically alters the board's dynamic, forcing black into a desperate defense. Initiating a bold counterattack, black aims to disrupt white's queen and recapture material, seeking to untangle their position from the pressure white has built up, particularly concerning the open d-file and the potential threats to their exposed king. Unleashing the queen to patrol the entire board, this move aggressively eyes the h7 pawn and supports the knight's continued dominance on c6, while also preparing to potentially reroute the queen to more dangerous diagonals or even create mating threats. Initiating a counterattack on the kingside, black boldly commits the rook to the g-file, seeking to exploit the open lines and the potential weakness around white's castled king. This aggressive maneuver aims to disrupt white's attacking structure and introduce complications, forcing white to defend against immediate threats. It's a gamble that sacrifices immediate material safety for dynamic counterplay, a hallmark of the Sicilian defense's sharp character. A bold maneuver, this knight's repositioning not only creates a powerful outpost on c6, shielding your king from immediate threats while eyeing the d8 square, but it also begins a subtle dance to untangle your queenside pieces, threatening to disrupt black's fragile coordination around their newly developed rook. Unleashing the queenside pawn storm, black initiates a bold counteroffensive, aiming to disrupt white's dominant central position and create immediate threats on the file. Unleashing the queen to hunt the beleaguered king, this decisive maneuver prioritizes immediate tactical retribution over subtle positional maneuvering, aiming to shatter black's defensive structure through overwhelming force. Re-establishing the rook on a semi-open file, this maneuver attempts to activate a long dormant piece and create potential threats along the third rank, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces. Securing the king on its new home, b1, redirects attention to the queenside, where black's recent rook maneuver aims to stir up trouble and potentially open lines for counterplay. This audacious pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's meticulously constructed queenside fortifications, seeking to exploit the slightly awkward placement of the knight and potentially open lines for its own rook, though it leaves the king vulnerable to the incoming storm. The immediate threat to black's king is immense, aiming to expose it further by eliminating the defender on g6. This aggressive continuation seeks to pry open lines and capitalize on the exposed black monarch. Sacrificing material for activity is a classic Sicilian counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's comfortable position and create counterplay for the exposed enemy monarch. Re-establishing pressure on the g-file while simultaneously preparing to reposition the queen, this maneuver aims to exploit the exposed black king and create further mating threats. Seeking refuge and regrouping, the black king bravely ventures to the queenside, aiming to escape the immediate storm of white's attacking pieces and find a safer haven on the open board. Suddenly, the queenside pawn structure becomes a glaring weakness for black, as white's rook initiates a bold, centralizing thrust to exploit it. Exploiting the open c-file, black attempts to bring the queen into the fray, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create counterplay against the exposed king. Unlocking the queenside pawns opens a decisive avenue for initiative. Unlocking the queenside majority, black initiates a daring pawn storm, aiming to shatter white's kingside defenses by creating a dynamic imbalance and potentially opening lines for their own pieces. Seizing the open file, white forces black's king into a precarious, exposed position, initiating a decisive attack. The king, having danced precariously through the center, now finds itself exposed on the edge of a collapsing queenside, a stark reminder that a misplaced monarch can quickly turn a material advantage into a swift demise.